Of course, the American version of Godzilla, the one with Raymond Burr, was dubbed, and over the years, a lot of people have, mocked the dubbing of that and many other monster movies. How was the dubbing done? How much preparation did the actors have for this? How carefully selected were the actors?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. Godzilla King of the Monsters, which is the American version of the film we're talking about, actually doesn't have a whole lot of dubbing. I mean, the whole device of inserting Raymond Burr into the film was a way of getting around that, because Raymond Burr essentially is not the protagonist. He is a commentator, a narrator. And basically what he does is observe the story and then tell you what the Japanese characters are doing, as if you were too stupid to figure it out for yourself. But nevertheless, there is some dubbing. Dubbing for Godzilla King of the Monsters is an exceptional case because it was very crude. I talked to some of the actors who worked on it, including James Hong, who is a very recognizable character actor who played the villain in Big Trouble in Little China. He's a very recognizable actor, and this was one of his first professional gigs. And he said they didn't even have the luxury of, looping against the film while they saw it, projected on the screen. They basically were given a script and sat down in front of a microphone and asked to read all their lines at various different speeds so that later on somebody could pair them up with the lip movements on the screen. But most of the Godzilla movies that are lambasted for the dubbing are the ones released in the 60s with titles like Destroy All Monsters and Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster and Monster Zero. Those films mostly were dubbed by professional actors. People like Hal Linden worked on some of those films because they were mostly dubbed by a company called Tetra in New York, and they employed stage actors who were free during the day. That's how some of them made a decent living during that time period.
One of the things that really intensifies all the effects of Godzilla, the sense of danger, the sense of destruction, is the score. It's a fantastic score. And worked into the score the sounds of the monster growling and the really frightening sounds of the monster's footsteps reverberating. Tell us something about the composer of the score.
Well, Akira Ifukube, boy, what can I say? I think the score for Godzilla, of course I'm biased, but I think it's one of the greatest film scores of all time. And of course, the motifs in Godzilla were reused and reworked continually throughout the golden age of the series in the 50s and the 1960s. Mr. Ifukube is a highly regarded classical composer in Japan. He scored many films, including several classics. And, without Ifukube's music, I don't think Godzilla would have made the impact that it did. The music is synonymous with Godzilla, as is Godzilla's War, which, by the way, Mr. Ifukube created through the manipulation of musical instruments and sound effects.
Well, we hear part of the score, and you'll hear the monster's footsteps and the monster's roar worked into it. Music from the soundtrack of Godzilla. The sound of Godzilla's footsteps have always seemed to me to be the sound of impending doom. Because it's this thunderous, reverberating sound, and you get the feeling it's coming closer. And so that's the feeling you're always left with when you hear these footsteps. It's like it's coming closer. The monster or the tragedy is approaching. How were those footsteps created?
Well, there are several accounts of how that was done. It seems to have been the most logical explanation seems to be a large drum that was beat and recorded, and reverb effects added to it. I don't think it was anything technically sophisticated at that time. This film really had a make it up as you go along approach. Whatever needed to be done, the filmmakers found a way to do it.
How was the monster's roar created?
The monster's roar, boy, isn't that one of the greatest sound effects in movie history? Every kid knows it. I remember when I was a child, we used to try to imitate it too, not too much success. It was created by rubbing a gloved hand, a leather gloved hand, over the strings of a double bass, recording that sound and manipulating it, changing the speed. And that's what they came up with. And Godzilla's roar basically was created using the same sound effects, even up until now. Now it's digitally altered, but it basically sounds the same. If you recall, during the 1960s, Godzilla's roar became more of a high-pitched whine, but it's more or less the same sound.
Do you think that the director of Godzilla, Ishiro Honda, saw it as a monster film or saw it as a parable about the dangers of nuclear weapons?
I think it's a little bit of both. Mr. Honda had served in the Japanese military during World War II, and upon his return home after the war, he had visited Hiroshima and witnessed the aftermath of the destruction there, and he was deeply affected by that, and he said so on several occasions. Godzilla is Mr. Honda's most personal film by far, and you can see the imprint that the war left on him. He worked personally on the script, and he spoke many, many times over the years about how his desire for this film, while it was an entertainment film by and large, but his desire was to send a message, not an indictment of America. The monster really, that's another difference between Godzilla and American monster movies of the same time period. The American monsters usually are stand-ins, as I said, for Cold War enemies. Godzilla is not really a stand-in for America. It is more of an indictment of the nuclear age, and Honda's hope was that somehow this film would inspire people to think about disarmament. I think today, if he were still alive, he'd be very disappointed that, nuclear weapons are possessed by more nations than ever before.
Do you remember the first time you saw Godzilla?
I do.
When was it, where was it, and how old were you?
I have a wonderful mother, Patricia, I love you, and I would never have discovered Godzilla if it weren't for her. I remember the first time I ever heard the word Godzilla. I was probably about 4 years old, and we were flipping channels, and my mother stopped on one channel. There was a dinosaur walking through a city, and I already loved dinosaurs. And my mother said, "That's Godzilla." Well, it wasn't Godzilla. It actually was the beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and once she realized that, she changed the channel. But the word Godzilla stuck in my brain, and I really wanted to know what it was, and she had told me the story of when Godzilla, King of the Monsters, first came out. She left work and went to a theater near her office, or the company where she worked, went to go see it, and I was just intrigued. I remember scouring the TV guide, and how we used to do in those days. You'd look through the listings, and the first time I located Godzilla, I stayed up until the middle of the night and watched it. Those things used to air in the pre-dawn hours in those days.
You've seen all of the Godzilla sequels. Which do you think are the worst?
Well, the film that is fairly universally regarded as the worst of the Godzilla series is called Godzilla vs. Megalon. And, this film has unfortunately been probably seen more widely than any other Godzilla film. It came out in 1973 in Japan, 76 roughly in the United States. And NBC actually broadcast it in prime time with John Belushi hosting it and introducing segments of the film wearing a Godzilla costume himself. It's pretty much widely known as a terrible film. Godzilla and a giant robot fight two other creatures, one of whom is a giant cockroach with drill bits for arms. The other is a cyborg alien buzzard with a buzzsaw in its stomach. It's crudely made. It's a lot of fun for laughs, but it's really not science fiction, in any sense of the word. And yet this film really has massive exposure relatively speaking. And I think a lot of people who just assume Godzilla is this campy, monster that is good for little more than wrestling matches and goofy antics are thinking of films like this one. That's why the release of this, the original Godzilla in its uncut form, and this, quote-unquote director's cut version is so important, because Godzilla didn't start out that way. It had serious intentions. And yes, it's an entertainment film. Yes, it's not meant to be taken too seriously. We're not talking about, Citizen Kane here. I recognize that. But nevertheless, the original film and the filmmakers who created it had higher aspirations than something like Godzilla versus Megalon. And let us not forget that.
Well, Steve Ryfle, thanks so much for talking with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Steve Ryfle is the author of Japan's Favorite Mon-Star. The original Japanese version of Godzilla has just been released in America for the first time in honor of the film's 50th anniversary.